The humidity on the island of Luzon in late May of 1945 was not merely a weather condition, but a physical weight that pressed down upon the lungs and the soul of every man unfortunate enough to walk its soil. The war in the Pacific was technically nearing its conclusion, as the Third Reich had already crumbled half a world away in Europe, yet the fighting here had devolved into something far more primal and grotesque than the organized maneuver warfare seen on the Western Front. Here in the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Army was shattered and cut off from supply lines and starving to death. But they had not surrendered, nor did they show any inclination towards self-preservation. They were cornered animals living in the root systems of the jungle and subsisting on worms and roots and the flesh of the fallen, waiting for the opportunity to take one more American life before they expired. The darkness of the jungle canopy turned day into perpetual twilight, and night into an abyssal void where sound traveled in deceptive echoes. For the soldiers of the United States 33rd Infantry Division, the enemy was not a formation on a map, but a phantom presence that watched from the foliage and waited for a moment of complacency. The terror was not in the artillery barrage or the tank assault, but in the silence that stretched between the raindrops falling on the broad, rotting leaves of the tropical flora. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that men discovered exactly who they were, and for most, the revelation was terrifying. But for a slight, unassuming man from Georgia named John R. McKinney, the jungle was simply another forest, and the enemy was simply another quarry. John McKinney was not a man who commanded a room when he entered it, nor was he the physical archetype of the American super soldier that filled the recruitment posters back in the States. He stood roughly 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed barely enough to keep his boots firmly planted in the mud of the Tayabas province. Yet there was a stillness to him that unsettled the men who did not understand the nature of the backwoods. He hailed from Haywood, Georgia, a place where the red clay stained everything it touched, and where a man did not eat if he could not shoot. He had grown up with a rifle in his hands, not as an instrument of war, but as a tool of survival, as essential as a plow or a hammer. In the grand, sweeping mechanism of the United States Army, McKinney was a cog that did not quite fit the polished machinery of drill and ceremony. He was often looked over for specialized details or heavy weapons assignments because of his small stature and his quiet demeanor, which was often mistaken for a lack of intelligence or drive. But the Army had failed to quantify the instinct of a hunter. They saw a small man, but they did not see the eyes that could track movement in high grass from 300 yards away, or the patience that allowed him to remain motionless for hours while insects bit at his skin and sweat ran in rivers down his spine. He had enlisted in the Army in 1942 and had been shipped to the Pacific, where the brutal reality of island-hopping warfare stripped away the veneer of civilization. By the time he found himself on the outpost line in Luzon, he was a sergeant, but he remained an enigma to many. He was the man who cleaned his rifle 3 times a day. He was the man who sharpened his bayonet until it could shave the hair off a forearm without touching the skin. He was the man who watched the tree line while others played cards or wrote letters home. The strategic situation in May of 1945 focused on clearing the remaining pockets of Japanese resistance that had retreated into the mountainous interior of Luzon to wage a protracted guerrilla war of attrition. The 33rd Infantry Division was tasked with rooting out these holdouts in operations that were less like battles and more like exterminations, conducted at close quarters with flamethrowers and grenades. The terrain was a nightmare of steep ravines and razor-sharp kogan grass that grew taller than a man and could slice open a hand as easily as a paper cut. The unit McKinney belonged to was positioned near the Umaray River, a waterway that snaked through the jungle and served as a potential infiltration route for enemy forces looking to escape the encirclement or launch suicide raids against the American rear. The command had established a perimeter of outposts to act as an early warning system and a tripwire against these incursions. These outposts were lonely islands of vulnerability in a sea of hostility, often manned by only 3 or 4 men who were expected to hold the line against unknown numbers in the pitch black of the tropical night. It was a duty that frayed the nerves of the strongest men as the imagination populated the darkness with monsters, and every snapping twig sounded like the bolt of an Arisaka rifle being driven home. For McKinney, however, the isolation of the outpost was preferable to the noise and confusion of the main camp. Out here, in the silence, he could hear. Out here, he could smell the rot and the rain and the faint metallic tang of ozone that preceded a storm or a firefight. On the afternoon of May 10, 1945, Sergeant McKinney and his small team were ordered to establish a perimeter outpost ahead of Company A to secure the flank against a suspected concentration of Japanese forces believed to be gathering in the valley below. The location chosen for the outpost was a slight rise in the ground, surrounded by dense undergrowth that offered excellent concealment for the enemy, but poor fields of fire for the defenders. It was a tactical nightmare, but in the jungle, one took the ground, one was given. McKinney surveyed the position with the critical eye of a man who knows that the difference between a good campsite and a bad one is whether you wake up in the morning. He directed his men to clear what brush they could without giving away their position, but the vegetation was relentless. They dug shallow foxholes more for psychological comfort than actual protection against the mortars that the Japanese no longer had the ammunition to fire. The sun began to dip below the canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out and grasp at the soldiers' boots. The air grew heavy and still, and the usual cacophony of jungle birds and monkeys died down to an unsettling murmur. McKinney felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was a sensation he had felt before in the woods of Georgia when a predator was near. It was the feeling of being watched by eyes that did not blink. He checked his M1 Garand rifle, running his thumb over the receiver and ensuring the action was smooth. He had acquired this weapon earlier in the campaign, and it had become an extension of his own body. It was a semi-automatic gas-operated rifle chambered in .30-06 Springfield, capable of delivering 8 rounds of armor-piercing death as fast as a man could pull the trigger. To McKinney, it was not a government-issued firearm. It was his life. As night fell over the Umire River sector, the darkness became absolute. The cloud cover obscured the moon, and stars plunging the jungle into a blackness so deep that a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. McKinney organized a watch rotation with his 2 other squad members, keeping one man alert while the others rested in the shallow depression of the tent they had erected. It wasn't a proper tent, but merely a shelter half strung up to keep the incessant rain off their heads and weapons. McKinney took the first watch, sitting silently in the mud, with his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the void for any variation in the texture of the darkness. He listened to the breathing of his comrades, and the drone of mosquitoes, and the distant rumble of thunder. Hours passed. The jungle was alive with the sounds of nocturnal feeding and mating, but McKinney filtered these out, searching for the rhythmic, unnatural sounds of human movement. The crack of a dry branch, the slosh of water displaced by a boot, the metallic clink of a canteen against a belt buckle. He heard nothing but the wind and the rain. When his shift was over, he woke the next man, a young private, whose eyes were wide with the strain of listening to ghosts. McKinney lay down on his cot, his body exhausted, but his mind still coiling like a spring. He did not sleep deeply. He slept the sleep of the hunter, drifting in a shallow state of consciousness, where the senses remained active. He placed his rifle beside him, not on the ground, but right against his hip, with his hand resting near the trigger guard. This was not regulation. This was instinct. The attack did not begin with a scream or a gunshot or an explosion. It began with a silence that was even more profound than the noise of the jungle. The insects stopped their chirping, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. In the pre-dawn gloom, roughly around 5:30 in the morning, a dense fog had rolled in off the river, wrapping the outpost in a cold, wet blanket that muffled sound and reduced visibility to zero. Under the cover of this gray shroud, an advanced patrol of the Japanese Imperial Army crept toward the American position. They were not fresh recruits, but hardened veterans of the island campaigns, men who had survived on bark, and hatred men who had sharpened their bayonets on stones and vowed to take as many Americans with them to the grave as possible. They moved on tabis, split-toed rubber-soled shoes that made no sound on the wet earth. They carried Arisaka rifles and curved sabers and satchel charges. They had spotted the outpost hours earlier and had spent the night crawling inch by inch through the mud, getting closer and closer until they were inside the perimeter wire that the Americans had not had time to string. They were ghosts materialized from the mist, standing over the sleeping forms of the Americans. Their objective was not to capture or to interrogate. Their objective was to slaughter. The leader of the Japanese patrol, a soldier driven by the Bushido code, and the madness of starvation signaled his men to attack. John McKinney was dreaming of Georgia. He was dreaming of the cool autumn air and the smell of pine needles and the weight of a shotgun on his shoulder. In his dream, he was tracking a buck through the brush, moving silently and with purpose. Suddenly, the dream shattered. He did not wake up because of a noise. He woke up because of a sensation of imminent death. His eyes snapped open, and in the gray light of dawn he saw a shadow standing over him. It was a silhouette of nightmare, a figure with a raised blade that gleamed dully in the low light. Before McKinney could process the image, the blade descended. It was a saber, wielded with the intent to decapitate the sleeping American. McKinney moved. It was a reflex, born of a lifetime of dodging branches and reacting to flushing game. He jerked his head to the side a fraction of a second before the steel bit into him. The sword missed his neck, but the tip slashed across the side of his head, severing a large portion of his right ear and slicing deep into his scalp. The pain was white-hot and blinding, a sudden explosion of agony that should have sent him into shock. Blood sprayed across his face and neck, warm and sticky, blinding him in one eye. The impact of the blow threw him back against the canvas of the tent. The Japanese soldier, seeing his strike connect but fail to kill, let out a guttural scream of frustration and triumph, a sound that was half animal and half human. He raised the saber for a second strike, intending to finish the job and cleave the small American's skull in two. He had made a fatal calculation. He assumed that a man who is attacked in his sleep is helpless. He assumed that a man who is bleeding from the head is defeated. He assumed that the small stature of his victim meant a lack of ferocity. In that split second between the first strike and the second, the Japanese soldier was not looking at a victim. He was looking at something entirely different. He was looking at a cornered predator. McKinney did not reach for his wound. He did not scream for a medic. He did not cower or beg for mercy. His hand, which had been resting near the trigger guard of his M1 Garand, clamped around the stock of the rifle with a grip that could have crushed stone. He ignored the blood pouring into his eye. He ignored the ringing in his ears. He ignored the fact that he was lying on his back in a collapsed tent with a swordsman standing over him. He swung the heavy rifle up, not bringing it to his shoulder for a refined shot, but thrusting the muzzle toward the center of the dark mass looming over him. The heresy of John McKinney was not that he had built a new weapon, but that he rejected the very concept of panic. In a situation where biological imperative dictates flight or freezing, McKinney chose absolute aggression. As the saber began its downward arc for the killing blow, McKinney squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand roared in the confined space of the tent, a deafening thunderclap that blew away the morning mist. The .30 caliber bullet struck the Japanese soldier in the chest at point-blank range. The kinetic energy of the round lifted the attacker off his feet and threw him backward out of the tent as if he had been kicked by a mule. The saber flew from his hand and landed in the mud. The gunshot shattered the silence of the jungle, waking the entire perimeter and signaling the beginning of a chaotic melee. But for McKinney, the war had narrowed down to a singularity. He scrambled to his feet, the blood running down his neck and soaking his shirt. He was dizzy, and the world was tilting on its axis, but his hands moved with the mechanical precision of a machine. He exited the tent into the swirling fog and the chaos. He was alone. His foxhole mates were either dead or scattered by the initial infiltration. He stood in the center of the clearing, a small, bloody figure in his underwear holding a rifle. The shot had not deterred the enemy, it had only announced the location of the prey. From the fog emerged more shapes. They were charging now, abandoning stealth for the shock of violence. They came with bayonets, fixed, screaming the name of their emperor, their faces twisted into masks of rage. There were dozens of them, a wave of khaki and steel crashing toward the single American standing by the collapsed tent. To any rational observer, McKinney was already dead. He was outnumbered. He was wounded. He was exposed. But McKinney did not see a wave of soldiers. He saw targets. He saw movement patterns. He saw the subtle shifts in weight as a man prepared to lunge. The world slowed down for him. The adrenaline flooded his system not with fear, but with a cold clarity. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the stock pressing against his bruised skin. He did not spray bullets wildly. He aimed. The first Japanese soldier lunged with a bayonet, aiming for McKinney's gut. McKinney sidestepped the thrust with a dancer's grace and fired a single round into the man's head, dropping him instantly. He pivoted to the left, where a second soldier was raising a rifle. McKinney fired again. Center mass. The soldier folded. The bolt of the Garand cycled back and forth with a metallic rhythm, ejecting hot brass casings into the mud. Ping, ping, ping. The Japanese attackers were confused. They had expected panic. They had expected the Americans to run. Instead, they had walked into a buzzsaw. This small, bleeding man was not retreating. He was advancing. McKinney moved forward, stepping over the bodies of the men he had just killed. He was shouting now, not in fear, but in a primal challenge, a deep-chested roar that matched the fury of his rifle. He was the hunter who had been cornered by the wolves and decided that he would be the one to do the eating. A Japanese officer charged him, waving a sword identical to the one that had taken his ear. McKinney waited until he could see the whites of the officer's eyes, until he could smell the sour breath of the man. He fired. The round took the officer in the throat. McKinney didn't pause to watch him fall. He swung the rifle right. Another target. Fire. Swing left. Another target. Fire. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds. McKinney made every single one of them count. When the clip ejected with its distinctive ping sound signaling the weapon was empty, McKinney did not fumble. He reached into his bandolier and slammed a fresh clip home with a fluidity that was terrifying to behold. The bolt slammed forward, chambering another round. He was back in the fight. But the enemy was not just in front of him. They were all around him. They were coming from the tree line, from the tall grass from the rear. They were throwing grenades and firing their Arisakas. Bullets whipped past McKinney's head, snapping through the air like angry hornets. Explosions threw dirt and shrapnel into the air. McKinney ignored it all. He was in a trance state. He saw a group of soldiers setting up a light machine gun near the edge of the clearing. If they got that gun operational, they would cut him in half. McKinney broke into a run, charging straight at the machine gun crew. It was suicide. It was madness. It was the last thing they expected. He fired from the hip as he ran, dropping one of the gunners. He closed the distance before they could traverse the weapon. He shot the second gunner at a range of 5 feet. The third man tried to grapple with him. McKinney smashed the butt of his rifle into the man's face, shattering bone and sending him reeling back into the brush. McKinney stood over the machine gun, panting his chest, heaving his face a mask of blood and mud. He looked around for more. He was not done. The jungle was still full of them, and he had plenty of ammunition left. The heresy was complete. The prey had become the predator, and the slaughter had only just begun. The silence that followed the destruction of the machine gun crew was not a cessation of violence, but merely the intake of breath before a scream. Sergeant John McKinney stood alone in the center of a kill zone that he had carved out of the jungle with nothing more than .30 caliber rounds and raw stubbornness. The adrenaline that had surged through his veins in the initial moments of the ambush was now beginning to mix with the dull, throbbing ache of his severed ear and the burning fatigue in his muscles. He was a man operating beyond the limits of human endurance, fueled by a singular primitive drive that overrode pain and reason. The M1 Garand in his hands was smoking hot, the wood of the stock slick with a mixture of rain and blood and sweat. To most men, the rifle was a heavy, cumbersome implement of long-range engagement, but in the hands of McKinney, it had transformed into a fluid extension of his will. He checked the action instinctively, his fingers dancing over the receiver to ensure the bolt was forward and locked. He had no way of knowing how many rounds were left in the clip, but he knew he would need every single one of them. The fog was still thick, swirling around the trees like restless spirits, making it impossible to see more than 10 yards in any direction. But McKinney did not need to see. He could feel the pressure of the enemy closing in again, like water rushing to fill a void. They were regrouping. They were communicating with sharp bird-like whistles and low guttural commands. They had realized that the outpost was not occupied by a squad of men, but by a single demon who refused to die. And they were determined to exorcise him. The second wave of the assault did not come with a scream. It came with the overwhelming force of a tidal wave. From the dense Kogon grass emerged a wall of khaki uniforms. They came from 3 sides simultaneously, a coordinated effort designed to overwhelm the lone defender through sheer weight of numbers. A rational soldier would have retreated. A rational soldier would have sought the relative safety of the deep jungle and lived to fight another day. But John McKinney was no longer operating on the logic of self-preservation. He was the anchor of the line, and anchors do not move. He raised the rifle, and the world narrowed down to the front sight post. The first target was a soldier sprinting low with a satchel charge intended to blow McKinney into oblivion. The shot was difficult, a moving target in low light through mist. McKinney fired. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping the explosives harmlessly into the mud. Before the echo had faded, McKinney had already acquired the next target. A soldier with a bayonet lunging from the left. McKinney did not have time to fire. He pivoted, driving the steel butt plate of the Garand into the attacker's temple with a sickening crunch. The wood of the stock held. The soldier's skull did not. This was the crucible of close-quarters combat, where ammunition was a luxury, and the rifle became a bludgeon. McKinney fought with a savagery that terrified the men trying to kill him. He was a whirlwind of motion, striking, shooting, and maneuvering. He never stayed in one spot for more than a second, moving constantly to deny the enemy a fixed target. The mechanics of the M1 Garand were being tested to their absolute breaking point. Designed by John C. Garand to give American infantrymen a semi-automatic advantage, the rifle was a marvel of engineering, but it was not designed to be used as a club or to fire hundreds of rounds in rapid succession without cooling. Yet in the hands of McKinney, the weapon performed flawlessly. The gas system cycled round after round the operating rod, driving the bolt back and forth with violent reliability. The heat radiating from the barrel was intense enough to blister skin, but McKinney did not feel it. He was reloading now with a speed that defied belief. He would fire until the clip ejected with its metallic ping, and in the same motion, he would be reaching for another clip from the bandolier draped across his chest. If he fumbled, he died. If the clip jammed, he died. If he hesitated, he died. There was no margin for error. He was firing at point-blank range, often engaging targets that were close enough to touch. At one point, a Japanese officer closed within sword range, swinging a katana that sliced the air inches from McKinney's face. McKinney parried the blow with the barrel of his rifle, the steel ringing out like a church bell. He followed the parry with a vertical butt stroke to the chin that lifted the officer off his feet. The fight had devolved into a primal brawl, a chaotic struggle for survival in the mud and the blood. McKinney was hit again and again, not by bullets, but by the debris of the battle, by falling bodies, by the sheer physical impact of collisions. His uniform was torn to shreds. His body was a map of bruises and lacerations. But he did not fall. As the sun began to burn through the morning mist, the true scale of the slaughter became apparent. The clearing around the outpost was carpeted with the bodies of the Imperial Japanese Army. They lay in piles where they had fallen, cut down by the relentless fire of the lone American. The attacks began to falter. The Japanese soldiers, who had started the morning with the intent of a banzai charge, were now hesitating. They looked at the carnage, and then they looked at the small, blood-soaked figure standing amidst the ruin. They saw a man who had been partially scalped, who was bleeding from a dozen wounds, who was completely surrounded, and yet who was still standing. They began to realize that they were not fighting a man. They were fighting a force of nature. The psychological impact of McKinney's stand was devastating. The momentum of the Japanese assault was broken against the rock of his resistance. They had thrown everything they had at him, and he had thrown it back with interest. The survivors began to pull back, melting away into the jungle, leaving their dead behind. But McKinney did not let them go. He pursued them to the edge of the clearing, firing until his last clip was empty. He stood there, panting his chest, heaving, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. His finger was still on the trigger. His eyes were still scanning. The monster inside him was still awake, waiting for one more reason to kill. It was only when the reinforcements from Company A finally arrived that the spell was broken. They came cautiously moving through the jungle in tactical formation, expecting to find the outpost overrun and the defenders dead. Instead, they found a scene that defied comprehension. The perimeter was silent save for the buzzing of flies. The ground was churned into a bloody quagmire, and there in the center of it all sat Sergeant John McKinney. He was cleaning his rifle. He had found a dry patch of cloth and was methodically wiping the mud and blood from the receiver of his M1 Garand. He looked up as the relief column approached his face, a mask of exhaustion and gore. He did not salute. He did not cheer. He simply nodded. The soldiers of Company A stopped in their tracks, staring at the scene around them. They began to count the bodies. 1, 5, 10, 20, 30. The count went on and on. They found bodies stacked on top of each other in front of McKinney's foxhole. They found bodies scattered in the brush where he had hunted them down. They found the machine gun crew he had eliminated. In total, they counted over 40 enemy dead surrounding the position of one man. 40 soldiers of the Imperial Army, highly trained and motivated, killed by a single soldier who had been asleep when the fight started. The lieutenant in charge of the relief column looked at McKinney and then at the carnage and was unable to speak. It was a scene from mythology, not modern warfare. The aftermath of the battle was a blur of medical evaluations and debriefings. McKinney was treated for his head wound, the doctors marveling at how close the saber had come to ending his life. The ear was sewn back together, the scalp stapled shut. He was given blood and antibiotics and told to rest. But the story of what had happened on that outpost began to spread through the 33rd Division like wildfire. Men came to look at him, not to talk, but just to see the man who had killed 40 Japanese soldiers before breakfast. They looked for signs of madness or divine intervention in his eyes, but they found only the quiet gaze of a Georgia hunter. He did not brag about what he had done. He did not embellish the details. When asked about the battle, he would simply say that he had done what was necessary. He had woken up. He had seen the enemy. He had fired his weapon. It was a simple equation to him, devoid of the heroism that others projected onto it. To McKinney, it was just a very bad morning that he had managed to survive. The Army, however, saw it differently. They recognized that what had happened was not just survival, but an act of supreme valor that went beyond the call of duty. Recommendations were written. Witness statements were collected. The paperwork for the highest military honor the nation could bestow began its slow journey up the chain of command. John McKinney returned to the United States not as a celebrity, but as a ghost drifting back into the world he had left behind. He received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in a ceremony that felt surreal and distant. The citation read like a work of fiction, detailing the saber attack, the destruction of the machine gun nest, and the single-handed defeat of an enemy company. But the medal around his neck did not erase the memories of the smell of blood in the mist or the sound of the saber slicing through his own skin. He returned to Georgia, to the red clay and the pine woods. He did not seek public office or write a book or go on speaking tours. He went back to the land. He lived a quiet life, farming and hunting, trying to find the peace that the jungle had stolen from him. The war had changed him in ways that could not be seen. He was jumpy. He preferred solitude. He carried the weight of the 40 lives he had taken and the lives of the friends he had lost. The locals knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself, a man who walked with a slight limp and had a jagged scar on his head. Few of them understood that they were walking in the presence of one of the deadliest combatants in American history. The years passed, and the legend of John McKinney faded from the public consciousness, replaced by new wars and new heroes. He grew old, his body slowing down, but his eyes remaining sharp. He never glorified war. He never told war stories to children. He understood the terrible cost of violence in a way that only a man who has waded through it can understand. He died in 1997, a quiet end to a tumultuous life. But in the archives of military history, and in the minds of the men who served with him, he remained a titan. The statistics of his engagement were studied by military theorists. The kill ratio of 40-1 in close combat was analyzed and debated, but the numbers could never capture the essence of the event. They could not capture the cold resolve of a man waking up to his own execution and deciding to rewrite the script. They could not capture the sound of the M1 Garand pinging in the mist. They could not capture the spirit of the American soldier who, when pushed to the edge of the abyss, did not fall, but instead built a bridge of bodies across it. John McKinney was not a super soldier. He was a man from Georgia who refused to lose. And on that morning in Luzon, he proved that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not a rifle or a bomb, but the will of a single man who has decided that he will not die today. The jungle has long since reclaimed the outpost near the Umire River. The foxholes have filled with mud, and the casings have rusted away. But the memory of the slaughter remains a ghost story, whispered in the dark, a reminder that there are monsters in the world, and sometimes they wear the uniform of the United States Army.